On Christmas morning 2024, Robert Thompson was found dead in his bed, with 3 gunshot wounds to the chest in his modest single-story home on Spokane's north side. Ethan Thompson, his 16-year-old son, made the frantic 911 call at 6:27 a.m., claiming that an intruder had broken in and murdered his father, while he hid terrified in his bedroom. The mid-sized Washington city of Spokane, accustomed to harsh winters but not to brutal holiday homicides, was stunned by the violence that had erupted in what neighbors described as a quiet, ordinary household. Investigators arriving at the snow-covered crime scene found the victim still in his bed, the sheets soaked with blood, and a window in the living room that appeared to have been forced open from the outside. Before we continue, please hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your support helps us continue bringing you these in-depth stories. Now let's get back to the story. Ethan Thompson sat wrapped in a shock blanket on the living room couch, his brown hair disheveled and his green eyes vacant, as he repeatedly told officers he had been asleep when he heard gunshots. He claimed to have stayed hidden in his room for nearly an hour before finding the courage to venture out and discover his father's body, at which point he immediately called 911. The teenager's account seemed plausible at first glance. The forced window, missing valuables, including Robert's wallet and watch, and Ethan's convincing display of shock, all pointed to a home invasion gone tragically wrong. Detective Lucas Harper, a 15-year veteran of the Spokane Police Department, noted in his initial report that the boy appeared genuinely traumatized, though he would later recall that something about his demeanor felt rehearsed. Robert Thompson's bedroom showed signs of a violent struggle, the nightstand overturned, a lamp shattered on the floor, and defensive wounds on his hands indicating he had awakened and fought for his life. The murder weapon, a .306 hunting rifle that belonged to Robert himself, was found discarded in the backyard near the fence line, partially buried in a snowdrift, as if the killer had attempted to hide it while fleeing. 3 spent shell casings were recovered from the bedroom floor, and the coroner would later determine that any one of the 3 shots would have been fatal, suggesting an attack fueled by rage rather than necessity. The timing of the murder, between 4 and 6:2 a.m. on Christmas morning, according to the medical examiner's preliminary assessment, added a particularly disturbing dimension to an already tragic scene. In the rugged landscape of Spokane, Washington, where the wide-open spaces can feel both liberating and isolating, the Thompson home suddenly became the epicenter of the city's attention. Local news crews gathered outside the police tape as neighbors stood in shocked clusters on their front lawns, Christmas decorations creating a surreal contrast to the grim proceedings. Ethan was taken to the station for further questioning, ostensibly to get him away from the traumatic scene. Though he was not considered a suspect at this early stage, Detective Harper ordered a thorough canvass of the neighborhood, hoping someone might have seen or heard something unusual in the pre-dawn hours of Christmas Day. Never expecting that, a neighbor's doorbell camera would soon become the linchpin of the entire investigation. The Thompson home, a modest 3-bedroom ranch-style house with fading blue siding, had been decorated for Christmas with multicolored lights along the eaves and a small artificial tree visible through the front window. Inside, wrapped presents still sat undisturbed beneath the tree, gifts that would never be opened, including several with tags reading, "To Dad, Love, Ethan." The kitchen counter held evidence of Christmas Eve preparations, cookie cutters, a rolling pin dusted with flour, and a plate of decorated Christmas cookies covered with plastic wrap. These domestic details stood in stark contrast to the violence that had erupted just hours later, creating a crime scene that even hardened investigators found unsettling in its juxtaposition of holiday cheer and deadly violence. Robert's bedroom, at the end of a short hallway, had become a horrific final resting place for the 42-year-old science teacher. Blood spatter analysis would later suggest that the first shot had been fired from the doorway, while Robert was sleeping with the subsequent shots delivered at closer range after he had awakened and attempted to defend himself. The hunting rifle, a Remington 700 with a walnut stock that Robert used for deer hunting in the mountains outside Spokane, required significant force to operate its bolt-action mechanism between shots. This detail would later become significant, as prosecutors questioned whether a panicked home invader would have taken the time to chamber multiple rounds rather than fleeing after the first shot, especially if the intruder was supposedly surprised by finding someone at home. As the initial crime scene investigation continued into Christmas afternoon, the Thompson family's personal history began to emerge through interviews with neighbors and colleagues. Robert had been raising Ethan alone since his wife Sarah died of breast cancer 5 years earlier, a tragedy that had reportedly brought father and son closer together. Neighbors described Robert as strict but loving, a dedicated father who coached Ethan's middle school science club and rarely missed his high school basketball games. Several mentioned that Robert had seemed concerned about Ethan's behavior in recent months, with one neighbor recalling an overheard argument about Ethan's curfew just days before the murder. Ethan's initial statement described a night of normal Christmas Eve activities, baking cookies with his father, watching It's a Wonderful Life, and going to bed around 10:30 p.m. He claimed to have slept soundly until gunshots woke him shortly after 6 a.m., at which point he hid in his closet until he was certain the intruder had left the house. His bedroom door had been closed all night, he insisted, and he had seen and heard nothing until the gunshots, a critical detail that would soon be contradicted by unexpected evidence. The teenager's demeanor shifted between moments of emotional breakdown and periods of eerie calm as he recounted finding his father's blood-soaked body, a pattern that experienced investigators recognized as potentially inconsistent with genuine trauma. By nightfall on Christmas Day, as most families in Spokane were finishing their holiday dinners, the Thompson home remained an active crime scene, bathed in the harsh glow of police floodlights. Technicians meticulously processed evidence late into the night, documenting blood patterns, collecting fibers, and casting impressions of footprints found in the snow outside the allegedly forced window. Ethan spent the night at his aunt's house across town, still maintaining his story of hiding from an intruder and expressing appropriate grief over his father's death. Detective Harper, however, was already requesting warrant access to Ethan's cell phone records and social media accounts, following standard procedure in homicide investigations, even when family members appeared to be victims rather than suspects. Robert Thompson had been a fixture at Spokane Central High School for 15 years, where he taught AP chemistry and coached the school's nationally recognized Science Olympiad team. Colleagues described him as passionate about education, the kind of teacher who arrived early and stayed late, often spending weekends helping students with special projects or college applications. His classroom was known for its engaging demonstrations and hands-on experiments, with former students frequently returning during college breaks to thank him for inspiring their scientific careers. Robert had received the Washington Science Educator of the Year award just 2 years before his death, with the citation praising his ability to make complex concepts accessible while challenging his students to exceed their own expectations. Beyond his professional accomplishments, Robert was remembered as a devoted single father who had reorganized his entire life after his wife's death to ensure Ethan's well-being remained his top priority. The walls of their Spokane home were covered with family photos, Robert and Ethan hiking in the nearby Selkirk Mountains, fishing along the Spokane River, and smiling together at his middle school graduation. Neighbors recalled Robert turning down dating opportunities and social invitations if they conflicted with Ethan's activities, telling friends that Ethan needs stability right now, not a parade of new people in his life. His dedication extended to learning to cook proper meals, mastering the intricacies of teenage boy fashion choices, and becoming both mother and father to his son, while maintaining his demanding career as an educator. Robert's sister, Margaret Thompson Hayes, shared during a tearful interview that her brother had recently expressed concerns about changes in Ethan's behavior and friend group. Rob called me about 2 weeks before Christmas, worried that Ethan was pulling away from him and keeping secrets. Margaret told Detective Harper. He said he'd become defensive about his phone, was breaking curfew, and seemed to be lying about where he was going after school. Rob thought he might be using drugs or falling in with a bad crowd, but he never imagined anything that could lead to this. Born and raised in Spokane, Robert had deep roots in the Washington community, where generations of Thompsons had lived since the early 1900s. His father had worked the railroads while his mother taught elementary school, instilling in Robert a strong work ethic and value for education that shaped his career choice. After earning his chemistry degree at Washington State University and completing a master's in education, Robert had returned to his hometown specifically to give back to the community that had supported him. The Thompson family name was respected throughout Spokane, making the shocking Christmas murder all the more incomprehensible to those who had known Robert throughout his life. Robert's passion for the outdoors was legendary among his friends and students with summer break, typically finding him leading wilderness expeditions for the local Sierra Club chapter or working on environmental conservation projects. His hunting rifles, including the weapon that would ultimately end his life, were always properly secured in a gun safe, used only for ethical hunting trips, where he taught Ethan about respecting nature and harvesting only what was needed. Robert was known to donate much of his deer meat to the local food bank each year, seeing hunting as a connection to Washington's heritage, rather than simply a sport or hobby. The irony that his own carefully maintained hunting rifle would become the instrument of his death would not be lost on prosecutors building their case against his son. The Christmas Eve before his murder had followed traditions Robert had maintained since Ethan was a small child, cutting a fresh Christmas tree from a permitted area in the nearby national forest, baking their secret recipe sugar cookies, and watching classic holiday movies together. Text messages from Robert's phone recovered during the investigation showed him reaching out to family members with warm holiday wishes and confirming plans for Christmas dinner the following day. His final text message sent to his sister at 9:48 p.m. on Christmas Eve read, "Merry Christmas. Ethan and I had a nice evening baking cookies. Looking forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. Love you." In the faculty lounge at Spokane Central High School, a makeshift memorial appeared spontaneously when news of Robert's death reached his colleagues, growing to include candles, photos, and dozens of heartfelt notes from current and former students. "Mr. T showed me I could do things I never thought possible." Read one card from a former student now studying chemistry at MIT. "He believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." The school's principal described Robert as the teacher everyone wanted their child to have, challenging but kind, demanding but supportive, the rare educator who connected with every student regardless of their academic ability or background. The autopsy revealed that Robert had been in excellent physical condition for a man of 42, with no health issues that would have shortened his life expectancy. The medical examiner noted that had he not been murdered, Robert could reasonably have expected another 30 to 40 years of life, decades in which he might have seen Ethan graduate college, watched him walk down the aisle, held grandchildren, and continued inspiring generations of students. This potential future, erased in seconds by 3 rifle rounds, was emphasized by prosecutors as they built their case around the magnitude of what had been stolen from Robert. From his students and from the Spokane community, the brutal manner of Robert's death contrasted sharply with the gentle, patient man described by everyone who knew him. Medical evidence indicated that he had awakened during the attack with defensive wounds on his hands and arms, showing he had tried to shield himself from the shots. Blood spatter patterns on the headboard and wall suggested he had been sitting up in bed when the final shot was fired at close range, likely looking directly at his killer in the final moments of his life. This detail would haunt those who knew the case intimately. The realization that Robert Thompson died, looking into the face of his own son, the child he had devoted his life to raising after his mother's death. Robert's funeral, delayed until after the new year due to the ongoing investigation, drew over 800 mourners from across Washington and neighboring states. Former students traveled from as far away as Boston and San Francisco to pay their respects to the teacher who had shaped their futures. The high school gymnasium, the only venue in Spokane large enough to accommodate the crowd, was filled to capacity as colleagues, students, and community members shared stories of Robert's kindness, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to education. Ethan Thompson was notably absent from the service, his arrest having occurred days earlier, a fact that sent shocked whispers through the gathering. Despite the efforts of Robert's sister to focus the service on celebrating her brother's life rather than the circumstances of his death, Detective Lucas Harper arrived at the Thompson home 20 minutes after Ethan's 911 call, navigating his unmarked police vehicle through the nearly empty streets of Spokane on Christmas morning. The detective, known for his methodical approach and attention to detail, immediately noted several inconsistencies at the scene that triggered his investigative instincts. The allegedly forced window showed pry marks on the outside frame, but the pattern seemed unusual, too neat, too deliberate, as if someone had studied break-ins from television rather than committing an actual forced entry. The house showed no signs of being ransacked, with only Robert's wallet and watch missing, despite several valuable electronics sitting in plain sight in the living room. Initial forensic processing revealed a crime scene that would yield crucial evidence in the coming days. The hunting rifle found in the backyard snow bore no fingerprints, having been wiped clean, but later testing would reveal traces of Ethan's DNA on the bolt action mechanism. Gunshot residue tests performed on Ethan's hands at the station came back positive, a fact he initially explained by saying he had checked his father's pulse and touched the area around his wounds. The medical examiner's preliminary report indicated that Robert had been shot between 4 and 5:30 a.m., based on body temperature and blood coagulation, contradicting Ethan's claim that he had heard shots just before calling 911 at 6:27 a.m. As uniformed officers conducted the neighborhood canvass, a crucial piece of evidence emerged that would ultimately break the case wide open. Trevor Phillips, who lived in the house directly across the street, mentioned to officers that his Ring doorbell camera had a view of the front of the Thompson home, including Ethan's bedroom window. "I installed it after someone stole our Christmas packages last year," Phillips explained. "And it records whenever there's motion on the street or when someone comes to our door." The footage, which Detective Harper immediately requested, revealed a critical contradiction to Ethan's story. His bedroom light could be seen turning on and off multiple times, between 4:12 a.m. and 5:48 a.m., during the exact time frame when he claimed to be asleep until being awakened by gunshots. The Ring camera footage became the investigation's breakthrough moment, providing irrefutable evidence that someone was active in Ethan's room during the critical time period. The camera's night vision capability clearly showed Ethan's bedroom window illuminating and darkening repeatedly, with particularly noticeable activity around 4:40 a.m., approximately when the medical examiner believed Robert had been killed. Detective Harper obtained a search warrant for Ethan's phone and laptop based on this contradictory evidence, suspecting that the motive for the crime might be found in his communications. The warrant also allowed officers to return to the Thompson home and conduct a more thorough search of Ethan's bedroom, where they discovered blood-spattered clothing hidden inside a ventilation duct accessible by removing a register in his closet floor. Ethan's initial police interview conducted by Detective Harper, while he was still considered a witness rather than a suspect, revealed a teenager who maintained remarkable composure despite occasional displays of emotion that never quite reached his eyes. He recounted hearing 3 distinct gunshots that woke him from a deep sleep, followed by the sound of someone moving through the house. "I was so scared I hid in my closet and didn't make a sound," he told Harper, his voice quavering appropriately. "I waited until I was sure they were gone before I came out and found Dad." When confronted with the Ring camera evidence during a follow-up interview, Ethan's carefully constructed narrative began to show cracks. He initially claimed he might have gotten up to use the bathroom during the night, then suggested he sometimes left his light on while sleeping, before finally asserting that the camera must be mistaken about the timestamps. Detective Harper noted in his report that Ethan's explanations evolved rapidly, as each was contradicted by evidence, displaying a troubling ability to generate alternative scenarios on the fly. His adaptability suggests premeditation rather than panic, Harper wrote, as he appears to be selecting the most plausible explanation from a menu of pre-considered options. Forensic analysis of Robert's hunting rifle revealed it had been removed from his locked gun safe, which showed no signs of forced entry. The combination, according to Robert's sister, was Ethan's birthday, a detail that both Ethan and his father would know, but that an intruder would have no way of discovering, especially in the limited time frame of a supposed break-in. The rifle's bolt-action mechanism required significant strength to operate, but testing confirmed that Ethan, despite his slight build, could manage it with some effort, particularly with the adrenaline boost that would accompany such a high-stress situation. 3 spent shell casings recovered from Robert's bedroom floor matched the ammunition stored in the gun cabinet, further contradicting the intruder theory. The medical examiner's detailed report, completed 3 days after the murder, provided a chilling timeline of Robert Thompson's final moments. The first shot had struck him in the upper chest while he was lying down, likely asleep, penetrating his right lung, but not immediately killing him. The second and third shots had been fired from slightly different angles, as Robert sat up and tried to protect himself, with the final shot entering his heart and causing almost instantaneous death. The report concluded that the killer had been standing at the foot of the bed for the first shot, then moved closer for the subsequent shots, executing them with deliberate aim rather than panic fire. Ethan's schoolmates interviewed as part of the expanding investigation painted a picture of a teenage boy who had changed dramatically in recent months. Several friends described Ethan as becoming increasingly secretive and withdrawn since the beginning of the school year, often canceling plans at the last minute and becoming defensive when questioned about his whereabouts. One friend, speaking on condition of anonymity, told investigators that Ethan had been dating someone older, way older, like college age, but had refused to introduce her to any of his friends. This lead prompted Detective Harper to obtain Ethan's social media and text message records, which would ultimately reveal the relationship at the heart of the case. As the investigation intensified, officers executed a search warrant on Ethan's iPhone, recovering deleted text messages and social media communications that revealed both motive and premeditation. The messages, primarily exchanged with a 23-year-old woman named Jessica Monroe, detailed a sexual relationship that had been ongoing for approximately 3 months. The communications revealed that Robert had recently discovered the relationship and threatened to report Monroe to police for statutory rape, which in Washington carries a penalty of up to 100 years in prison if the victim is under 16 years of age. Ethan had turned 16 just 2 weeks before the murder, but the relationship had begun when he was still 15, putting Monroe at significant legal risk. The neighbor's Ring camera footage, initially valuable for contradicting Ethan's alibi, proved even more crucial when forensic technicians enhanced the video to reveal shadows moving past the bedroom window. By correlating these movements with cellular data, showing Ethan's phone accessing different Wi-Fi access points within the house, investigators could place him moving between his bedroom and his father's room during the exact time frame when the murder occurred. This digital evidence, combined with the physical evidence of blood-spattered clothing and gunshot residue on Ethan's hands, transformed what had initially appeared to be a tragic home invasion into something far more disturbing. A son's calculated decision to murder his father, rather than end a forbidden relationship. Detective Lucas Harper sat alone in the Spokane Police Department's digital forensics lab, replaying the Ring doorbell footage for the 6th time in 2 hours. The snow-muted streetscape of the quiet residential neighborhood showed little activity in the pre-dawn hours of Christmas morning. But Ethan Thompson's bedroom window told a different story. Harper had created a detailed timeline chart noting each instance when the light went on or off. 4:12 a.m. on, 4:17 a.m. off, 4:22 a.m. on again, and so on in a pattern that suggested someone moving purposefully through the house, rather than sleeping soundly, as Ethan had claimed. The detective's experienced eyes caught something he had missed in previous viewings, a shadow passing by the window at 4:38 a.m., moving in the direction of Robert Thompson's bedroom at the back of the house. Forensic technicians processing the crime scene had recovered 3 shell casings from the bedroom floor, all positioned within a 6-foot radius that suggested a stationary shooter, rather than someone moving defensively during a struggle. The blood spatter analysis told a story that contradicted Ethan's account of an intruder. The patterns on the walls and ceiling indicated that all 3 shots had been fired from approximately the same position at the foot of Robert's bed, with no evidence of chaotic movement or struggle, until after the first shot had been fired. Most damning was the cast-off blood pattern discovered on the sleeve of Ethan's nightshirt, hidden in the ventilation duct, which perfectly matched the arterial spray from Robert's final chest wound. Ethan's gunshot residue test had come back positive on both hands, with particularly heavy concentrations on his right palm and between his thumb and forefinger, a distribution pattern consistent with firing a rifle, rather than merely touching a wound site as he had claimed. When confronted with these results during his second interview, Ethan had offered a series of increasingly implausible explanations, from suggesting he must have touched the rifle after finding it in the yard, to claiming he had helped his father clean his guns the previous week. Detective Harper noted that Ethan's explanations became more specific and technical as he realized the weakness of his position, demonstrating a calculated attempt to generate plausible deniability rather than genuine confusion. The turning point came when digital forensic specialists recovered deleted text messages from Ethan's phone, revealing both a motive and a timeline that aligned perfectly with the Ring camera evidence. The messages exchanged with 23-year-old Jessica Monroe painted a picture of a relationship that had crossed multiple boundaries: legal, ethical, and familial. "My dad found out about us," Ethan had written at 10:47 p.m. on December 23rd. "He went through my phone while I was showering and saw our pics. He's furious and says he's going to the police after Christmas." Monroe's response had been equally incriminating. "She can't do that to me. I'd lose everything. My job, my apartment, maybe go to prison. You have to talk him out of it." The exchange continued with increasing urgency, with Ethan eventually texting, "He said if he catches us together again, he's calling the cops on you for statutory. I can't let that happen." Monroe's final message before the murder, sent at 11:52 p.m. on Christmas Eve, read, "Whatever happens, delete these messages and remember I love you. We'll figure something out." The cellular data from Ethan's phone provided another layer of damning evidence, showing that despite his claim of being asleep until the gunshots, his phone had connected to different Wi-Fi access points within the house as he moved from room to room. At 4:36 a.m., the phone connected briefly to the kitchen access point. Then at 4:40 a.m. to the hallway access point before returning to the bedroom access point at 4:52 a.m. This digital trail aligned perfectly with the Ring cameras, footage of lights turning on and off, creating an irrefutable timeline of Ethan's movements through the house during the commission of the murder. During the execution of a search warrant on Ethan's school locker, investigators discovered a notebook containing what appeared to be practice signatures of his father's name. Dozens of attempts to perfect Robert Thompson's distinctive handwriting. This discovery prompted a forensic examination of Robert's financial documents, revealing that someone had attempted to set up a transfer of $50,000 from his retirement account to a newly created checking account just hours before the murder. The transfer had been flagged and held by the bank's fraud department due to the unusual timing and amount, preventing what investigators believed was Ethan's attempt to secure funds for himself and Monroe after eliminating his father. Jessica Monroe, brought in for questioning 3 days after the murder, initially denied any knowledge of Robert Thompson's death beyond what she had seen on local news. The 23-year-old shift manager at a local electronics store maintained that she and Ethan were just friends and had never had a sexual relationship, a claim immediately contradicted by explicit photographs recovered from both their phones. When Detective Harper presented Monroe with a text message exchange about Robert threatening to contact police, Monroe's demeanor changed visibly, her earlier confidence giving way to nervous fidgeting and stammered responses that suggested consciousness of guilt. While Monroe denied any direct involvement in the murder itself, cell tower data placed her phone within half a mile of the Thompson home between 3:30 a.m. and 4:05 a.m. on Christmas morning, contradicting her alibi of being home alone sleeping. Further investigation revealed that Monroe had purchased a prepaid burner phone 3 days before the murder, which had connected to the cell tower nearest the Thompson home at 4:10 a.m. before being deactivated permanently. This evidence suggested that while Monroe may not have pulled the trigger, she had been in communication with Ethan immediately before the crime and may have been waiting nearby, perhaps as a planned getaway driver. The weapon itself provided additional evidence pointing directly to Ethan. The Remington 700 rifle, recovered from the snow in the Thompsons' backyard, had been wiped clean of prints, but still contained microscopic skin cells in the checkering of the wooden stock that DNA analysis matched to Ethan. The gun safe from which the rifle had been taken showed no signs of forced entry, and the combination, Ethan's birthday, would have been known only to him and his father. Most telling was the methodical way the rifle had been operated. The bolt action had been worked smoothly between shots, the scope had been properly used for targeting, and the safety had been engaged before the weapon was discarded, all indicating someone familiar with the specific firearm. Ethan's internet search history, recovered by digital forensics experts, revealed queries in the weeks leading up to the murder that suggested extensive premeditation. How long does gunshot residue last on skin? Can police trace deleted text messages? How to make murder look like break-in? And perhaps most chillingly, father-son murder cases where son got away with it. These searches had been conducted in private browsing mode and later deleted, but were recoverable from the laptop's hard drive using specialized forensic tools. The systematic research into methods of concealing evidence demonstrated a level of planning that prosecutors would later cite as evidence of cold, calculated intent. With the evidence mounting, Detective Harper made the decision to formally arrest Ethan Thompson for the first-degree murder of his father. The arrest took place at his aunt's home 7 days after the murder, with Ethan showing little visible reaction as the detective read his Miranda rights. He seemed almost relieved. Harper would later testify as if a weight had been lifted now that the pretense was over. Ethan remained silent during the car ride to the juvenile detention center, staring out the window at the snow-covered streets of Spokane, the city where he had grown up and where he had, according to the mounting evidence, methodically planned and executed the murder of his own father. District Attorney Olivia Warren stood at the evidence board in the Spokane prosecutor's office, methodically connecting the strings between photographs, phone records, and forensic reports that would form the backbone of the state's case against Ethan Thompson. The Ring camera footage played on a nearby monitor, showing the telltale flicker of Ethan's bedroom light in the pre-dawn hours of Christmas morning. Digital evidence that had cracked the case wide open and led investigators down the path to dozens of additional incriminating discoveries. Warren had been a prosecutor for 20 years, but the calculated nature of this particular crime committed by a teenager against his own father on Christmas Day struck her as uniquely disturbing even within her extensive experience with homicide cases. The forensic analysis of Ethan's laptop and phone had yielded what Warren considered the strongest evidence of premeditation, trail of deleted searches revealing weeks of research into methods of staging crime scenes and evading detection. Particularly damning were searches conducted on December 20th, just 5 days before the murder. How to clean gunshot residue from hands. Best time for break-in to look realistic. And can police trace deleted text messages between phones? This digital breadcrumb trail painted a picture, not of an impulsive act committed in the heat of passion, but of a methodically planned execution designed to eliminate Robert Thompson while establishing an alibi for Ethan. Precisely the kind of premeditation required for a first-degree murder charge. Prosecutor Samuel Phillips, assigned as lead counsel on the case, worked closely with Detective Harper to establish a definitive timeline that connected the Ring camera footage with Ethan's cell phone activity and the medical examiner's determination of time of death. The resulting chronology was devastatingly precise. At 4:12 a.m., Ethan's bedroom light turned on and his phone connected to his room's Wi-Fi access point. At 4:36 a.m., his phone connected to the kitchen Wi-Fi access point as he retrieved the rifle from the gun safe. At 4:40 a.m., the phone connected to the hallway access point as he moved toward his father's bedroom. And at 4:43 a.m., the medical examiner's estimated time of the first gunshot, based on blood coagulation and body temperature calculations. This timeline, supported by multiple independent sources of evidence, systematically dismantled Ethan's initial claim of being asleep until hearing gunshots around 6 a.m. The relationship between Ethan and Jessica Monroe emerged as the central motive in the prosecution's theory of the case. Text messages recovered from both their devices revealed that Robert had discovered their inappropriate relationship just 2 days before Christmas, threatening to report Monroe to police for statutory rape once the holiday had passed. Ethan's text to Monroe showed escalating panic about this threat, culminating in the damning message sent at 11:26 p.m. on Christmas Eve. He's serious about going to the police. He showed me the state law on his computer and said you could get 100 years because I was 15 when we started. I can't let him ruin your life like that. I'll figure something out tonight. Forensic accounting revealed that Ethan had attempted to access his father's financial accounts in the hours before the murder, successfully obtaining his banking passwords from his personal journal and attempting to initiate a transfer of $50,000 to a newly opened account in his name. The transfer had been automatically flagged by the bank's fraud prevention system due to the unusual amount and timing, preventing the funds from moving, but providing prosecutors with clear evidence that Ethan had planned not only to eliminate his father, but also to secure finances for his future with Monroe. Banking records also showed that Monroe had recently researched apartments in Portland, suggesting the couple planned to flee Washington after the murder. The murder weapon itself yielded critical evidence linking Ethan directly to the crime. While the rifle had been wiped clean of fingerprints, DNA analysis of skin cells found on the wooden stock matched Ethan's genetic profile with a probability of 99.9997%. The location where the rifle was discovered partially buried in snow, near the back fence of the Thompson property, matched precisely with footprints leading from the back door of the house. Footprints that snow accumulation patterns indicated had been made shortly after 5 a.m. on Christmas morning. Most significantly, the footprints matched the size and tread pattern of Ethan's winter boots recovered from his closet, with traces of snow still visible in the tread, despite an apparent attempt to clean them. Jessica Monroe's involvement in the planning stages became increasingly clear as investigators pieced together her communications with Ethan. While there was insufficient evidence to charge her as an accomplice to the actual murder, prosecutors built a compelling case that she had been aware of and tacitly supportive of Ethan's plans. Cell tower data placed her primary phone within half a mile of the Thompson home until approximately 4:05 a.m. on Christmas morning, and a prepaid burner phone purchased by Monroe had connected to the tower nearest the Thompson home at 4:10 a.m. before being permanently deactivated. This pattern suggested that Monroe had been standing by nearby, possibly as a planned getaway driver before the relationship between the burner phone and her regular phone raised suspicions that led her to abandon this part of the plan. The blood evidence recovered from the crime scene told a story that contradicted every element of Ethan's initial account of an intruder. Batter patterns on the walls and ceiling of Robert's bedroom indicated that all 3 shots had been fired from the same position, at the foot of the bed with the shooter remaining stationary, rather than moving defensively during a struggle. Blood found on Ethan's nightshirt hidden in the ventilation duct in his bedroom contained a spatter pattern, consistent with arterial spray from the third and final shot to Robert's chest, a pattern that could only have been created if Ethan had been standing approximately 4 feet from his father when the fatal bullet struck his heart. Most damning was the presence of both Ethan's and Robert's DNA and blood smears found on the gun safe dial, suggesting he had returned the key to the gun cabinet after the murder, with his father's blood still on his hands. Interviews with Ethan's friends and classmates revealed a teenager who had become increasingly secretive and isolated in the months before the murder, withdrawing from previous social circles and fabricating elaborate stories to explain his whereabouts when meeting with Monroe. Several friends described instances when Ethan had expressed frustration with his father's strict rules, particularly regarding dating and curfews, with one friend recalling Ethan stating in November, "Sometimes I wish I could just make my own decisions without him controlling everything." While such statements might be typical teenage complaints in normal circumstances, in the context of the murder, they took on a far more sinister tone, suggesting a building resentment that eventually culminated in violence. Robert Thompson's sister, Margaret Hayes, provided prosecutors with crucial context regarding the family dynamics in the months before the murder. Margaret described a conversation with her brother just 3 days before his death, in which Robert had expressed serious concerns about Ethan's relationship with an older woman. Rob told me he'd found inappropriate pictures on Ethan's phone and confronted him about who this woman was, Margaret stated in her witness interview. When he realized the woman was 23, Rob was horrified and told Ethan this was illegal and dangerous. Ethan apparently became enraged, screaming that he was ruining his life and that he couldn't control who he loved. This account aligned perfectly with the text messages Ethan sent to Monroe immediately after this confrontation, providing independent corroboration of the prosecution's timeline and motive theory. As the case against Ethan Thompson solidified, District Attorney Warren made the controversial decision to charge the 16-year-old as an adult rather than proceeding through the juvenile justice system. Washington law permitted this approach for first-degree murder cases involving defendants as young as 12, particularly when the crime demonstrated a high degree of premeditation and maturity of judgment. The methodical planning evident in this case, from the research into crime scene staging to the attempted financial transfers, shows a level of calculation that warrants adult prosecution. Warren explained at the press conference announcing the charges. The deliberate nature of this crime, committed against the victim's own father while he slept on Christmas morning, demonstrates a callousness and sophistication that the juvenile system is not designed to address. The formal arrest of Ethan Thompson took place on January 2nd, 7 days after the Christmas morning murder of his father. Detective Lucas Harper and a female officer arrived at Margaret Hayes' home, where Ethan had been staying since the crime, with a warrant charging him with first-degree murder. Margaret, who had been gradually coming to terms with the mounting evidence against her nephew, collapsed into a kitchen chair when officers explained the purpose of their visit. Her face a mask of disbelief despite the case that had been building day by day. Ethan, by contrast, showed little visible reaction to the arrest, maintaining the same oddly detached composure that had characterized his behavior throughout the investigation. As Harper read the Miranda warning, Ethan stood perfectly still in his aunt's living room, his green eyes focused somewhere in the middle distance, as if he were mentally elsewhere. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The detective noted that while most suspects showed some emotional response to these familiar but consequential words, fear, anger, despair, Ethan simply nodded slightly at each statement, as if mentally checking items off a list. Only when the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrist did a brief flash of something, perhaps the reality of his situation, cross his face before the mask of calm returned. The drive from his aunt's house to the Spokane Police Department took 17 minutes, during which Ethan remained silent in the back seat of the unmarked police car, staring out at the snow-covered landscape of the city he had called home his entire life. Detective Harper, watching him in the rear-view mirror, was struck by his apparent detachment from the gravity of his situation. There were no tears, no desperate proclamations of innocence, none of the panic typically displayed by teenagers in custody. Ethan's composure, which might have seemed admirable in other circumstances, struck the experienced detective as profoundly unnatural, reinforcing his growing conviction that they were dealing with a suspect whose emotional responses did not fall within typical parameters. The interview room at the Spokane Police Department was deliberately sparse. A metal table bolted to the floor, 3 chairs, a video camera in the upper corner, and a one-way mirror along one wall. Ethan sat with perfect posture in the hard metal chair, his hands now free of handcuffs, but folded neatly on the table before him as Detective Harper and Dr. Sarah Levine, a forensic psychologist, entered the room. The presence of Dr. Levine was unusual for an initial post-arrest interview. But the psychological aspects of the case, a 16-year-old boy allegedly murdering his father over a forbidden relationship, had prompted the prosecution to request expert observation from the earliest stages of formal questioning. Harper began the interview with basic background questions, establishing a rapport while observing Ethan's baseline communication patterns, his eye contact, speech rhythms, and body language during non-threatening inquiries. The detective noted that Ethan maintained unusually consistent eye contact, rarely blinking, and showing minimal variation in facial expression regardless of the question's content. His responses to questions about school, friends, and hobbies were detailed and articulate, but delivered in a flat affect that suggested he was reciting rather than conversing, a pattern Dr. Levine would later describe in her notes as consistent with rehearsed rather than spontaneous communication. When Harper shifted the focus to the Ring camera footage showing Ethan the video of his bedroom light turning on and off during the hours he claimed to be sleeping, the first cracks in his composure appeared. "Can you explain why your light was on at 4:12 a.m. when you told us you were asleep until after 6 a.m.? Harper asked, sliding still images from the footage across the table. Ethan's eyes flickered briefly to the door before he offered his first explanation. "I probably got up to use the bathroom." When Harper pointed out that the pattern showed multiple light switches over nearly 2 hours, Ethan's second explanation followed smoothly. "I have trouble sleeping sometimes, so I might have been reading or on my phone." Each explanation came quickly without the pauses or uncertainty that typically accompany truthful recollection, suggesting to both Harper and Dr. Levine that these were prepared contingencies rather than genuine attempts to remember. The pivotal moment in the interrogation came when Harper placed a printout of Ethan's text messages with Jessica Monroe on the table, messages explicitly discussing Robert's discovery of their relationship and his threat to report Monroe for statutory rape. "He said if he catches us together again, he's calling the cops on you for statutory. I can't let that happen." Ethan's own words stared up at him from the page. The timestamp showing the message had been sent less than 7 hours before his father was murdered. For the first time, Ethan's carefully maintained composure visibly faltered. His eyes widened, his breathing quickened, and his right hand moved unconsciously to his throat in a classic stress response. "I didn't mean it like that," Ethan said, his voice higher and faster than it had been moments before. "It was just talk, just me being dramatic." Harper noted that unlike his previous explanations, which had been delivered with steady eye contact, Ethan now looked away from both the detective and the text message evidence, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall behind them. "Everyone says things they don't mean when they're upset," he continued, a slight tremor now visible in his hands, despite his apparent attempts to control it. "Jessica and I were just venting. We would never have actually done anything to hurt my dad." Harper methodically laid out additional evidence. The DNA found on the rifle, the gunshot residue on his hands, the blood-spattered clothing hidden in the ventilation duct, and the internet searches about staging crime scenes. With each new piece of evidence, Ethan offered increasingly elaborate explanations, each one less plausible than the last. The rifle DNA was from helping Dad clean his guns last weekend. The gunshot residue came from checking his pulse and touching the wounds. The blood-spattered clothing was from when I found him and held him. Each explanation came quickly, suggesting preparation, but the accumulation of contradictory evidence was clearly wearing down his ability to maintain consistent counter-narratives. 4 hours into the interrogation, after Harper had systematically dismantled each of his explanations with contrary forensic evidence, Ethan's carefully constructed facade finally collapsed entirely. His shoulders slumped, his gaze dropped to the table, and his voice, when he finally spoke again, was barely above a whisper. "He was going to ruin everything," he said, the words hanging in the silent interview room. "Jessica would have gone to prison. We would never have been together. Dad didn't understand what we had. He just saw Jessica's age and went crazy." What followed was a confession that chilled even the experienced detective and psychologist. Ethan described waiting until his father was asleep, retrieving the rifle from the gun safe using the combination he had known for years, and standing at the foot of his bed for nearly 10 minutes before firing the first shot. "I wanted to make sure he was really asleep," he explained, his voice now eerily calm again. "I knew the first shot had to be perfect or he might fight back. He was strong, much stronger than me." The clinical detachment with which he described calculating bullet trajectories, working the bolt between shots, and watching his father's final moments struck Dr. Levine as particularly significant, indicating what the psychologist would later testify was an unusual capacity to compartmentalize emotions and remain task-focused during extreme situations. When Harper asked about his feelings in the moment of pulling the trigger, Ethan's response was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire confession. I felt nothing. It was like watching someone else do it. I remember thinking about the physics of the bullet, the weight, the speed, the impact, but not about it being Dad. It wasn't until I saw the blood that I realized what was happening, and by then I had to finish it. It would have been cruel not to. This dissociative response, combined with the logical, problem-solving approach to the actual killing, prompted Dr. Levine to make notes about potential personality disorder traits that would become significant during later psychiatric evaluations. The final phase of Ethan's confession included details that had not yet been discovered by investigators, lending credibility to his account. He described originally planning to flee with Monroe immediately after the murder, using the $50,000 he had attempted to transfer from his father's retirement account. Jessica was supposed to wait down the street in her car, but something went wrong. Her phone kept going straight to voicemail after 4:10, and I couldn't risk going looking for her with Dad's blood on my clothes. This detail aligned perfectly with the cell tower data, showing Monroe's burner phone connecting briefly at 4:10 a.m. before being deactivated, providing independent corroboration of Ethan's account and suggesting that Monroe's involvement in the planning stages was more substantial than she had admitted. As the confession concluded, and Harper prepared to transfer Ethan to the Juvenile Detention Center, he made a final statement that would later feature prominently in both psychiatric evaluations and the prosecutor's case for trying him as an adult. I know it was wrong in a legal sense, but sometimes you have to make hard choices to protect the people you love. Dad gave me no other option. The calm rationalization of patricide as a reasonable solution to an interpersonal problem delivered without apparent remorse or emotional distress struck both Harper and Dr. Levine as indicative of a profound disconnect between Ethan's cognitive understanding of social norms and his emotional experience of violating them, a disconnect that would become central to the prosecution's portrayal of Ethan as a calculating killer who had made a deliberate choice to eliminate his father rather than end his relationship with Monroe. The Spokane County Courthouse in Spokane, Washington, stood as a monument to justice amidst the rugged landscape, its stone facade dusted with early morning frost on March 15th. As the trial of State versus Ethan Thompson began, media trucks lined the street outside. National attention, having been drawn to the case of the 16-year-old boy, charged as an adult for the Christmas morning murder of his father. Inside the wood-paneled courtroom, Prosecutor Samuel Phillips arranged his materials at the government's table, the methodical organization of his files reflecting the systematic case he intended to present to the jury of 8 women and 4 men who had been seated the previous day after an intensive voir dire process that had eliminated potential jurors with strong opinions about trying juveniles as adults. Ethan Thompson sat beside his court-appointed defense attorney, Catherine Morrison, his appearance dramatically transformed from the teenager who had been arrested in January. Gone were the casual clothes and messy hair, replaced by a conservative navy blue suit, minimal grooming and hairstyle to make him appear younger and more vulnerable. A deliberate strategy by the defense team to emphasize his youth to the jury. Despite this careful visual presentation, observers noted that Ethan's demeanor remained unusually composed for a teenager facing life imprisonment, his posture perfect and his expression neutral, as he surveyed the courtroom with the detached interest of someone watching a play, rather than participating in their own murder trial. Judge Harold Blackwood, a 30-year veteran of the bench known for his strict courtroom management and scrupulous fairness, entered from his chambers and called the court to order. This court will now hear case number CR 2025-0472, State of Washington versus Ethan Lewis Thompson, he announced, his deep voice carrying to the back of the packed gallery. The defendant is charged with murder in the first degree in the death of Robert James Thompson. How does the defendant plead? Catherine Morrison rose, placing a supportive hand on Ethan's shoulder that the teenager neither acknowledged nor shrugged off. Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty by reason of diminished capacity. The diminished capacity plea represented the defense's core strategy, not denying that Ethan had killed his father, but arguing that his age, emotional state, and the coercive influence of his older girlfriend had rendered him incapable of the kind of deliberate, premeditated decision-making required for a first-degree murder conviction. This approach aimed to secure either a conviction on the lesser charge of second-degree murder or manslaughter, or potentially to have the case remanded to juvenile court, where Ethan would face a maximum sentence of confinement until age 21 rather than life imprisonment. Morrison had spent weeks working with psychiatric experts who would testify that Ethan's adolescent brain, combined with the emotional manipulation by a much older girlfriend, had created a perfect storm of impaired judgment. Prosecutor Samuel Phillips rose for his opening statement, moving to stand directly before the jury box rather than using the podium, establishing an intimate connection as he began to lay out the state's case. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case about choices." He began, his voice measured and conversational rather than dramatic. "Difficult choices, calculated choices, and ultimately a choice to end a human life. The evidence will show that on Christmas morning 2024, the defendant, Ethan Thompson, made a series of deliberate decisions that resulted in the death of his father, Robert Thompson." Phillips methodically outlined the prosecution's timeline, emphasizing the evidence that demonstrated premeditation, the internet searches about staging crime scenes and cleaning gunshot residue, the attempt to transfer money from Robert's accounts, and the text messages discussing the motive. Robert's discovery of Ethan's relationship with 23-year-old Jessica Monroe, and his threat to report Monroe for statutory rape. This was not an impulsive act of passion or a moment of temporary insanity. Phillips told the jury, "The evidence will show weeks of planning, careful execution, and calculated attempts to cover up the crime afterward. The defendant researched how to make murder look like a break-in, practiced his father's signature to access his money, and created an elaborate false narrative about an intruder that he maintained until confronted with irrefutable evidence." The prosecutor then introduced what would become the centerpiece of the state's case, the Ring doorbell camera footage from the neighbor's house across the street. This seemingly insignificant home security device captured something the defendant never anticipated: proof that he was awake and moving through the house during the exact time frame when his father was murdered, directly contradicting his claim of being asleep until hearing gunshots. A large screen displayed still images from the footage showing Ethan's bedroom light turning on and off at critical times. This digital evidence, combined with cell phone records placing his phone moving through different parts of the house at these same times, will establish, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Ethan Thompson was not only awake but actively carrying out a murder plan during the hours he claimed to be sleeping. Phillips then addressed the defense's diminished capacity strategy head-on, a tactical decision to diffuse its impact before it was even presented. "You will hear arguments that Ethan Thompson was too young, too emotional, too influenced by an older girlfriend to be held fully accountable for his actions. But the evidence will show a level of planning, problem-solving, and rational decision-making that belies any claim of diminished capacity." He held up printouts of Ethan's internet searches, displaying them for the jury. "These are not the actions of someone with impaired judgment or decision-making. These are the methodical preparations of someone who has decided that murder is a solution to their problems and is taking steps to avoid getting caught." Defense attorney Catherine Morrison's opening statement presented a starkly different interpretation of the same facts, framing Ethan as a victim himself, manipulated by an older woman, of a brain still developing the capacity for impulse control and judgment, and of a society that sexualizes teenage boys while punishing them for responding to adult attention. Ethan Thompson was 15 years old when he met Jessica Monroe, a woman 7 years his senior, who systematically isolated him from friends and family while engaging him in an illegal sexual relationship. Morrison told the jury, her voice conveying quiet outrage. What the prosecution calls planning was in reality the desperate flailing of a traumatized child who had been convinced by his adult abuser that his father's appropriate parental intervention would destroy both their lives. Morrison directly addressed the Ring camera evidence, acknowledging its factual accuracy while reframing its interpretation. Yes, Ethan was awake during those hours. Yes, he took the rifle. Yes, he ended his father's life. These facts are not in dispute. She paused, making eye contact with several jurors. What is in dispute is whether a 16-year-old boy in the midst of psychological manipulation by an adult sexual predator who had been told repeatedly that his father was going to ruin both their lives possessed the full capacity to premeditate murder in the legal sense required for a first-degree conviction. The evidence will show that Ethan was operating under extreme emotional distress with a brain physiologically incapable of the kind of rational risk assessment and impulse control we expect from adults. As opening statements concluded, Judge Blackwood instructed the prosecution to call its first witness, and Samuel Phillips announced, "The state calls Detective Lucas Harper." The veteran detective took the stand and, after being sworn in, began methodically establishing the basic facts of the case: the Christmas morning 911 call, the initial crime scene observations, and the gradual shift from viewing Ethan as a victim to identifying him as the prime suspect. Harper's testimony was delivered with the precise, unemotional professionalism that had characterized his investigation, allowing the facts to create their own impact without embellishment or drama. Phillips displayed crime scene photographs on the courtroom monitor, showing Robert Thompson's body in his bed, the blood-soaked sheets, and the 3 bullet wounds to his chest. The brutality of the images caused visible reactions among the jurors, with several wincing or looking away momentarily. Ethan, however, showed no discernible response to the photographs of his father's body, a lack of affect that did not go unnoticed by the jury, despite the judge's instructions to focus on evidence rather than the defendant's courtroom demeanor. Harper explained the trajectory of each bullet, the lack of defensive wounds on Robert's hands for the first shot, suggesting he had been asleep, and the evidence that the shooter had remained in essentially the same position for all 3 shots. The detective then described the discovery that had broken the case open: the neighbor's Ring doorbell camera footage contradicting Ethan's alibi. This evidence was crucial because it established that someone was active in Ethan's room during the exact time frame when Robert Thompson was killed, Harper explained, as Phillips played the relevant portions of the footage. The light pattern showed activity at 4:12 a.m., 4:22 a.m., 4:36 a.m., and several other times, directly contradicting Mr. Thompson's statement that he had been asleep until hearing gunshots around 6:30 a.m. During cross-examination, defense attorney Morrison worked to humanize Ethan while questioning Harper, focusing on his age, his emotional state immediately after the murder, and the potentially coercive nature of police interrogation techniques used with adolescents. "Detective, would you agree that teenagers often make impulsive decisions without fully considering consequences?" Morrison asked. Harper acknowledged this general principle, while maintaining that Ethan's actions had shown systematic planning rather than impulsivity. "And would you agree that a 16-year-old's brain is not fully developed in terms of impulse control and risk assessment?" Again, Harper conceded the general point while emphasizing the specifics of Ethan's case that indicated deliberate planning. The most dramatic moment of Harper's testimony came when Phillips introduced the recovered text messages between Ethan and Jessica Monroe, displaying them on the courtroom monitor for the jury to read. He said, "If he catches us together again, he's calling the cops on you for statutory. I can't let that happen." Ethan's words, sent hours before his father's murder, hung in the courtroom like a confession. Morrison objected to the presentation of these texts without proper context, arguing they represented the desperate words of a manipulated child rather than evidence of murderous intent. But Judge Blackwood overruled, allowing the messages to stand as evidence for the jury to interpret. As the first day of testimony concluded, Phillips had established a solid foundation for the prosecution's case, presenting concrete evidence of Ethan's movements on Christmas morning through the Ring camera footage, and introducing the text messages that established a clear motive for the crime. Morrison, meanwhile, had begun laying groundwork for the diminished capacity defense, emphasizing Ethan's youth and the potentially coercive influence of his relationship with Monroe. The stage was set for what promised to be a trial that would explore not only the facts of Robert Thompson's murder, but the broader questions of adolescent brain development, legal culpability, and the justice system's approach to juvenile offenders charged with adult crimes. Dr. Raymond Griffith, the state's digital forensics expert, took the stand on the fourth day of the trial, his academic demeanor and precise language lending scientific credibility to what would become the most technically compelling testimony against Ethan Thompson. With 20 years of experience in digital evidence analysis and a PhD in computer science, Dr. Griffith methodically explained how multiple independent digital systems had captured Ethan's movements on Christmas morning, creating what he called a digital fingerprint timeline that contradicted his initial alibi at every turn. The expert adjusted his glasses as the prosecution displayed a complex timeline chart, mapping the Ring camera footage, cell phone data, and Wi-Fi connection logs onto a single chronological framework that placed Ethan moving through the house precisely when his father was killed. The Ring doorbell camera across the street captured Ethan's bedroom light turning on at 4:12 a.m., Dr. Griffith explained, pointing to the corresponding video segment. At this exact same moment, cellular data shows his phone connecting to the Wi-Fi access point in his bedroom. This pattern continues as he moves through the house. At 4:36 a.m., his phone connects to the kitchen Wi-Fi access point, which corresponds with the light pattern changes visible in the Ring footage. At 4:40 a.m., his phone connects to the hallway access point. And at 4:43 a.m., the medical examiner's estimated time of the first gunshot, his phone is connected to the access point nearest his father's bedroom. The digital forensics expert then presented his analysis of Ethan's internet search history, displaying a chronological list of queries that painted a disturbing picture of premeditation. How to make murder look like break-in, December 10th. Cleaning gunshot residue from skin, December 18th. How long after death can coroner determine time? December 20th. And most damning, will deleting text messages remove evidence? December 24th, just hours before the murder. Dr. Griffith explained the technical process by which these searches had been recovered, despite Ethan's attempts to delete his browsing history, noting that digital evidence is remarkably persistent, even when users believe they have removed it. During cross-examination, defense attorney Catherine Morrison attempted to challenge Dr. Griffith's interpretation of the digital evidence, suggesting alternative explanations for the internet searches and phone movements. Isn't it possible that a teenager might search for information about crimes out of simple curiosity, perhaps related to a television show or school assignment? She asked. Griffith acknowledged this possibility in general terms, but countered that the specific pattern and timing of these searches, combined with their direct relevance to the crime as it was actually committed, makes coincidental curiosity extremely unlikely from a statistical perspective. Dr. Sarah Levine, the forensic psychologist who had observed Ethan's post-arrest interrogation, provided testimony that the prosecution strategically positioned between technical experts to maintain the jury's engagement. Dr. Levine described Ethan's unusual emotional presentation during questioning, his flat affect, his rapid generation of alternative explanations when confronted with evidence, and most significantly, his lack of emotional response when discussing his father's death. What struck me as particularly notable was Mr. Thompson's ability to describe the physical act of shooting his father 3 times with remarkable detachment, as if recounting a scene from a movie rather than his own actions. Dr. Levine testified her professional demeanor, not quite masking her own disturbance at what she had witnessed. The psychologist went on to explain that while adolescent brains are indeed still developing, particularly in areas related to impulse control and risk assessment, Ethan had demonstrated none of the typical adolescent patterns of impulsive decision-making. The level of planning evident in this case, from researching methods to stage a break-in, to practicing his father's signature for financial transfers, to creating and maintaining a detailed false narrative, shows sustained goal-directed behavior over weeks, not the kind of impulsive action we typically associate with adolescent crime, Dr. Levine explained. While Mr. Thompson's age is certainly relevant to understanding his actions, the evidence suggests a level of calculated planning more consistent with adult patterns of criminal behavior than with typical adolescent impulsivity. The defense's cross-examination of Dr. Levine focused on challenging her qualifications to assess adolescent brain development, emphasizing that her specialty was in criminal psychology rather than adolescent neuroscience. Morrison also questioned whether Dr. Levine's assessment had been biased by her close work with law enforcement during the investigation. "Isn't it true, Doctor, that you were brought into this case by the prosecution specifically to build a case against my client, rather than to provide an objective assessment?" Morrison asked, her tone suggesting the answer was self-evident. Dr. Levine firmly rejected this characterization, citing her professional ethics and explaining that her role had been to observe and document Ethan's psychological presentation, not to assist in building the prosecution's case. The testimony that seemed to most visibly affect the jury came from Robert Thompson's sister, Margaret Hayes, who provided a deeply personal window into the victim's life and his relationship with his son. Margaret described her brother as a devoted single father who had reorganized his entire life after his wife's death to ensure Ethan's well-being remained his top priority. "Rob loved Ethan more than anything in the world," she testified, her voice breaking with emotion. "After my sister-in-law died, he turned down job opportunities that would have advanced his career, but taken time away from Ethan. He learned to cook his favorite meals, helped with homework, attended every basketball game. Everything he did was for him." Margaret went on to describe the conversation she had with her brother just 3 days before his murder, when he discovered Ethan's relationship with Jessica Monroe. "Rob was distraught, not angry," she recalled. "He showed me the inappropriate pictures he'd found on Ethan's phone and said, 'He's just a child, Marg. This woman is taking advantage of him.' He was worried about protecting Ethan, not punishing him." This testimony directly contradicted the defense's portrayal of Robert as a controlling father, interfering with his son's happiness, instead presenting him as a parent genuinely concerned about his welfare and trying to protect him from an illegal and potentially exploitative relationship. When asked about Ethan's behavior after the murder, during the week he stayed at Margaret's home before his arrest, his aunt described a behavior that several jurors visibly found disturbing. "He never cried, not once," Margaret testified. "He talked about the funeral arrangements as if we were planning a school event, asking about the catering and whether we should have programs printed. The night before his arrest, I found him looking at college websites, schools in Oregon State, far from Washington. When I asked if he was thinking about the future, he said, 'I have to move forward.' Dad would want that." There was something so wrong about how normal he seemed. Jessica Monroe's testimony, which the prosecution had strategically saved for late in their case, provided critical corroboration of the motive established through the recovered text messages. Though Monroe had not been charged as an accomplice due to insufficient evidence of direct involvement in the murder itself, she had agreed to testify in exchange for immunity from prosecution for her sexual relationship with Ethan while he was under 16. Monroe appeared nervous on the stand, her testimony halting and reluctant as she confirmed that Robert Thompson had discovered their relationship and threatened to report her to police after Christmas. "Ethan texted me that his dad had found out about us," Monroe testified, avoiding eye contact with both the prosecutor and Ethan. "He was freaking out, saying he was going to call the cops and I could go to prison. I told him we needed to cool things off, maybe break up for a while until he turned 18. But he kept saying he couldn't lose me, that he'd figure something out." When asked directly about her knowledge of Ethan's plan to kill his father, Monroe denied any prior knowledge or involvement, claiming that her presence near the Thompson home in the early hours of Christmas morning had been coincidental. An explanation the jury appeared to find implausible based on their visible reactions, though insufficient evidence existed to charge her as an accessory. The defense's case centered on testimony from Dr. Miranda Chen, a nationally recognized expert in adolescent neuroscience, who provided detailed explanations of how teenage brains differ structurally and functionally from adult brains, particularly in areas related to impulse control, emotional regulation, and decision-making under stress. Using colorful brain scan images displayed on the courtroom monitor, Dr. Chen explained that the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for rational decision-making and understanding long-term consequences, remains underdeveloped until the mid-20s, while the limbic system, which processes emotions and rewards, is already fully functional in adolescence. This developmental mismatch creates a perfect storm in the teenage brain, Dr. Chen testified where strong emotions and desire for reward can overwhelm the still developing systems for rational control and decision-making, particularly in situations involving intense emotional states or perceived threats to important relationships. The neuroscientist explained that from a brain development perspective, Ethan's age placed him at a particularly vulnerable point where the capacity for adult-like reasoning existed, but could be easily overwhelmed by emotional factors, especially in the context of a sexual relationship with an older partner who held significant psychological influence. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Phillips challenged Dr. Chen's application of general neuroscience principles to Ethan's specific case. Dr. Chen, would you agree that despite these general patterns of brain development, many 16-year-olds are capable of understanding that killing another person is wrong? He asked. Chen acknowledged this point but emphasized that understanding an action is wrong in the abstract is different from having the neurological capacity to apply that understanding in emotionally charged situations. Phillips then displayed Ethan's internet search history, asking, "Do these systematic searches over weeks, carefully designed to plan a murder and avoid detection, suggest impulsive action or calculated planning?" Chen conceded that the searches indicated planning rather than impulse, but maintained that such planning could still occur under the influence of emotional distress and manipulative pressure from an adult sexual partner. The most scientifically precise testimony came from Dr. Ayla Fujimoto, the medical examiner who had performed Robert Thompson's autopsy, using detailed anatomical diagrams rather than the more disturbing autopsy photographs out of respect for the court's decorum. Dr. Fujimoto explained the path of each bullet through Robert's body and the timing of his death, based on blood coagulation and body temperature. The first bullet entered the upper right chest, puncturing the lung, but not causing immediate death, she explained. The victim would have awakened at this point, likely in extreme pain and gasping for breath. The second bullet entered the left shoulder area, as the victim was apparently sitting up based on the bullet's downward trajectory. The third and final shot entered directly into the heart, causing immediate cessation of cardiac function and death within seconds. This clinical description of Robert's final moments had a visible impact on the jury, with several members wincing or looking down at their hands. Dr. Fujimoto went on to explain that the precision of the shots, particularly the final heart shot, suggested someone familiar with firearms and anatomy. The third shot was placed with remarkable accuracy for someone in a high-stress situation. She noted it struck precisely where it would cause the most immediate fatal damage. When asked by the prosecution whether this level of accuracy was consistent with a panicked or impulsive shooting, Dr. Fujimoto stated that in her professional experience, such precision typically indicated a degree of focus and intentionality not usually present in impulsive violence. As the evidence phase of the trial neared its conclusion, Ethan Thompson himself took the stand against the advice of his defense team, a decision that would prove pivotal in the jury's ultimate assessment. Dressed in a simple blue suit with his hair pulled back, Ethan appeared younger and more vulnerable than he had at the start of the trial, though observers noted that his composure remained unusual for a teenager facing life imprisonment. His testimony began with a soft-spoken account of his childhood, his mother's death from cancer, and his close relationship with his father in the years that followed. "I loved my dad," Ethan testified, his voice steady despite the courtroom's tension. "He was my best friend after Mom died. He taught me to fish, helped me with science projects, came to every basketball game." When asked by his attorney about the changes in their relationship, Ethan described meeting Jessica Monroe at the electronics store where she worked, the gradual development of their romantic relationship, and his father's discovery of their inappropriate text messages and photos. "Dad was so angry," he said, the first tears of the trial finally appearing in his eyes. He said Jessica was a predator who was using me, that he was going to call the police and have her arrested. I tried to explain that we loved each other, but Dad wouldn't listen. Ethan's account of the murder itself was delivered with disturbing detachment, despite the emotional setup that had preceded it. "I couldn't sleep that night," he testified. "I kept thinking about Jessica going to prison, about never seeing her again. I remembered the combination to Dad's gun safe. It was my birthday. I stood in his doorway for a long time just watching him sleep. I don't remember pulling the trigger the first time, but I remember the sound and Dad sitting up, blood on his chest. After that, I just wanted it to be over quickly so he wouldn't suffer. This clinical description of patricide delivered without the emotional distress one would expect from a teenager, recounting such a traumatic event, appeared to disturb rather than persuade many jurors whose expressions reflected increasing skepticism as his testimony continued. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Phillips methodically walked Ethan through his internet searches about staging crime scenes and cleaning gunshot residue, his attempt to transfer money from his father's accounts, and the elaborate false narrative he had maintained, until confronted with the ring camera evidence. Throughout this questioning, Ethan maintained a composed, almost analytical demeanor, explaining each action as a response to his fear of losing Jessica and his belief that his father wouldn't understand our love. When Phillips directly asked, "Do you feel remorse for killing your father?" Ethan's response seemed to crystallize the jury's assessment. "I regret that it came to that. I wish there had been another solution." The conspicuous absence of emotional language. No mention of missing his father, of loving him, of wishing he could undo his actions, hung in the courtroom like an unspoken confession of the emotional disconnect that had allowed a son to murder his father over a forbidden relationship. On April 2nd, after 7 days of testimony and 14 hours of deliberation, the jury in the case of State versus Ethan Thompson returned to the Spokane County Courthouse, ready to deliver their verdict. The crowded courtroom fell silent as the 12 jurors filed in, their expressions grave and purposeful, as they took their seats in the jury box. Judge Harold Blackwood, his black robes a stark contrast to the warm wood paneling of the courtroom, addressed the jury foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses, rose and replied, "We have, Your Honor." The bailiff carried the verdict form to Judge Blackwood, who reviewed it briefly before returning it to be read aloud. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as the foreperson stood again and unfolded the paper in her hands. "In the case of State of Washington versus Ethan Lewis Thompson on the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant." She paused, making eye contact with Ethan for the briefest moment. "Guilty." A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel as Margaret Hayes covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Not for the verdict itself, which she had come to expect, but for the finality it brought to the destruction of her family. Ethan Thompson, who had maintained remarkable composure throughout the trial, showed his first significant emotional reaction to the verdict. His face paled visibly, his eyes widening as the reality of his situation seemed to finally penetrate the detachment he had displayed for months. Defense attorney Catherine Morrison placed a supportive hand on her client's shoulder, as Judge Blackwood asked, "Is this the unanimous verdict of the jury?" Each juror responded affirmatively as their names were called, many looking directly at Ethan as they confirmed their decision, some with sadness, others with the firm resolve of those convinced of justice served. Judge Blackwood scheduled the sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later, allowing time for the preparation of pre-sentencing reports and victim impact statements. As Ethan was led from the courtroom by sheriff's deputies, he glanced back at the nearly empty defense section of the gallery. No family members remained to support him, his aunt having aligned herself with the prosecution after becoming convinced of her nephew's guilt. The only person who met Ethan's gaze was Jessica Monroe, who had attended sporadically throughout the trial, despite her own legal jeopardy and social ostracism in Spokane. Their brief eye contact across the courtroom would be dissected endlessly by media commentators in the days that followed, some seeing remorse in Ethan's expression, others noting the apparent absence of any emotional connection between the two, despite the relationship that had allegedly motivated the murder. The sentencing hearing on April 16th drew national media attention with legal analysts debating whether Judge Blackwood would impose the maximum possible sentence on a juvenile defendant or show leniency based on Ethan's age despite the brutal nature of the crime. The courthouse steps were crowded with protesters holding contradictory signs, some demanding justice for Robert with maximum sentencing, Others arguing children don't belong in adult prisons and advocating for rehabilitation rather than punishment. The polarized response reflected broader national debates about juvenile justice, with Ethan Thompson becoming an unwitting symbol in arguments about adolescent brain development, appropriate punishment, and the justice system's handling of juvenile offenders. Inside the courtroom, Margaret Hayes delivered a victim impact statement that moved many observers to tears, speaking directly to her nephew as she described the devastating impact of Robert's murder. "Ethan, your father loved you more than anything in this world," she said, her voice steady despite her evident emotion. "He changed careers to be more present for you after your mother died. He learned to cook your favorite meals, helped with your homework, and cheered at every basketball game. He was so proud of your intelligence, your determination, your potential. And now he's gone, not because of illness or accident, but because you decided his life was worth less than your relationship with a woman who manipulated and exploited you," Hayes continued, addressing not only the personal loss, but the broader impact of Robert's murder on his students and community. "You didn't just kill your father that morning. You took a beloved teacher from hundreds of students, past and present. You took a dedicated environmental advocate from our community. You took a brother, a friend, a colleague who had decades of contribution still to make. And for what? For a relationship with a woman who hasn't even tried to contact you since your arrest, who testified against you to save herself." This statement caused Ethan to look toward Jessica Monroe in the gallery, seeing for the first time that she had not attended the sentencing hearing, her absence perhaps finally bringing home the reality that the relationship he had killed for was already over. Prosecutor Samuel Phillips focused his sentencing recommendation on the premeditated nature of the crime and Ethan's apparent lack of genuine remorse. "Your Honor, the evidence presented at trial demonstrated not a moment of passion or impulsivity, but weeks of calculated planning culminating in an execution-style murder carried out while the victim slept." Phillips argued the defendant researched methods to stage the crime scene, attempted to secure finances for his escape, and maintained an elaborate false narrative until confronted with irrefutable evidence. Perhaps most disturbing is his continued inability to express authentic remorse for taking his father's life. His statements focus on regret for the consequences to himself, rather than grief for the life he took. Defense attorney Catherine Morrison made a passionate plea for leniency based on Ethan's age, arguing that recent Supreme Court decisions had recognized the diminished culpability of juvenile offenders due to their still developing brains. "Your Honor, the law has increasingly recognized what science has proven, that adolescents are fundamentally different from adults in ways that directly impact culpability." Morrison argued, "Ethan's brain, like that of all teenagers, is still developing the capacity for impulse control, risk assessment, and resistance to peer influence. The influence of a predatory older girlfriend, combined with his age and the trauma of losing his mother during formative years, created circumstances that warrant consideration during sentencing." When offered the opportunity to speak before sentencing, Ethan rose slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he faced Judge Blackwood. "I know what I did was wrong," he began, his voice barely audible at first. "I can't take it back, no matter how much I might want to. I've had a lot of time to think in jail, and I understand now that Jessica manipulated me, that Dad was trying to protect me." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words for the first time in the proceedings. "I miss my dad. I miss who I was before all this happened. I'm sorry for what I did, and I know sorry isn't enough, but it's all I have to offer." This statement, which might have seemed appropriate from another defendant, struck many observers as strangely performative coming from Ethan, the words conventionally correct, but delivered with an emotional flatness that suggested recitation rather than authentic expression. Judge Blackwood watched him carefully throughout, his expression revealing nothing of his assessment of his sincerity. When Ethan had returned to his seat, the courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to deliver his sentence, the weight of his decision hanging in the air. Judge Blackwood began by acknowledging the unique challenges of sentencing a juvenile defendant for such a serious crime. The court is mindful of recent jurisprudence regarding juvenile offenders and the scientific evidence of adolescent brain development," he stated, giving momentary hope to the defense team. However, the court must also consider the specific circumstances of this case, including the extensive premeditation, the violation of the profound trust between parent and child, and the defendant's apparent inability to fully appreciate the moral gravity of his actions, even after months of reflection. The judge continued, addressing Ethan directly as he approached his decision. "Mr. Thompson, you took the life of the person who loved you most in this world, who had dedicated his life to your well-being since your mother's passing. You did so not in a moment of passion or under extreme duress, but after weeks of planning, motivated by a desire to continue a relationship that was itself inappropriate and potentially exploitative. While your age is a mitigating factor that the court has carefully considered, the calculated nature of this crime, the vulnerability of the victim as he slept, and your sustained efforts to avoid responsibility demonstrate a level of moral culpability that cannot be dismissed as mere adolescent impulsivity." The courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath as Judge Blackwood delivered his final judgment. "It is therefore the sentence of this court that you, Ethan Lewis Thompson, having been found guilty of murder in the first degree, shall be committed to the Washington State Prison for the term of your natural life without the possibility of parole." The pronouncement fell like a physical blow, causing Ethan to sway slightly in his seat as the judge continued. "You have taken a life that cannot be restored and broken, a trust that cannot be repaired. The magnitude of this crime committed against your own father as he slept on Christmas morning warrants the maximum penalty provided by law." Judge Blackwood then uttered the words that would be quoted in headlines across the country. "Mr. Thompson, given your age and the nature of this sentence, I feel compelled to make its meaning absolutely clear to you. This court is sentencing you to die in prison. You will never again know freedom. You will grow old and eventually die while incarcerated. This is the consequence of your decision to end your father's life." The brutal clarity of this statement finally broke through Ethan's composure, his face crumpling, as the reality of his future became inescapable. As the deputies moved to take Ethan into custody, he turned toward his aunt in the gallery, reaching out one hand in a gesture that seemed to seek connection or forgiveness. But Margaret Hayes turned away, unable to meet the eyes of her brother's killer, despite their blood relation. This final rejection appeared to complete Ethan's emotional collapse, and he was led from the courtroom in tears. The composed, calculating demeanor he had maintained throughout the investigation and trial, finally giving way to the reality of a 16-year-old boy facing a lifetime behind bars with no family, remaining to support him in the relationship he had killed for already dissolved. Outside the courthouse, reactions to the sentence were sharply divided along predictable lines. Victim advocates and those who had known Robert Thompson expressed satisfaction with what they viewed as appropriate justice for a calculated murder, while juvenile justice reformers and child development experts criticized the sentence as excessively harsh for an offender whose brain was still developing. Media commentators debated whether the case represented justice served or an example of the justice system's failure to appropriately distinguish between adult and juvenile offenders, with Ethan Thompson becoming an unwitting symbol in the ongoing national conversation about juvenile justice reform. 6 months after Ethan Thompson's sentencing, the Washington Men's Prison in Spokane had become his permanent residence. The teenager assigned to a special unit for high-profile offenders, requiring additional security measures. Prison officials reported that Ethan had initially struggled with the rigid structure and loss of autonomy, his previous self-possession giving way to periods of emotional volatility, alternating with drawn silence. The prison psychologist noted in her assessment that Ethan showed signs of delayed traumatic response, as if the emotional reality of his actions and their consequences had been held at bay during the trial, only to emerge with devastating force once the possibility of freedom was permanently removed. Medications were prescribed for depression and anxiety, conditions that the psychologist noted were not unexpected in an adolescent facing a lifetime of incarceration for killing his parent. Ethan's first appeal, filed in October 2025, focused on the constitutionality of sentencing a juvenile offender to life without parole, citing recent Supreme Court decisions that had restricted such sentences for defendants under 18. His appellate attorney, Marcus Jenkins of the Washington Innocence Project, argued that the sentence constituted cruel and unusual punishment, given Ethan's age at the time of the offense and contemporary understanding of adolescent brain development. The Washington Supreme Court, however, upheld the sentence in a 4-3 decision, finding that the particularly calculated nature of the crime and the extensive evidence of premeditation placed Ethan's case within the narrow category of juvenile offenses still eligible for life without parole under federal precedents. Jessica Monroe, whose relationship with Ethan had been the catalyst for Robert Thompson's murder, left Spokane immediately after the trial, her reputation destroyed, and her future prospects in Washington non-existent, despite having avoided criminal charges related to the murder itself. She eventually settled in Portland, under a slightly altered name, but the digital footprint of her involvement in the case followed her, resulting in lost jobs and housing opportunities whenever new employers or landlords searched her background. While Ethan served his sentence in prison, Monroe experienced a different kind of punishment: social ostracism and the inescapable knowledge that her relationship with a minor had set in motion the events leading to Robert Thompson's death, a burden that acquaintances reported she carried with visible weight. Margaret Hayes, Robert's sister and Ethan's aunt, sold the Thompson family home 6 months after the sentencing, unable to drive past the property without being overwhelmed by memories of both her beloved brother and the nephew who had destroyed their family. The house sold significantly below market value, despite the strong Spokane real estate market. The stigma of the Christmas murder, making many potential buyers uncomfortable, despite the property's attractive features. Margaret established a scholarship in Robert's name at Spokane Central High School, providing annual funding for a promising science student to pursue higher education, ensuring that her brother's legacy as an educator would continue despite his untimely death. The scholarship's first recipient was Mia Hernandez, a senior at Spokane Central, who had been in Robert Thompson's AP chemistry class during his final semester of teaching. At the scholarship award ceremony, Mia spoke movingly about Mr. Thompson's influence on her educational journey. Mr. Thompson was the first teacher who ever told me I could be a scientist, who showed me that chemistry wasn't just about memorizing formulas, but about understanding how the world works at its most fundamental level. He stayed after school for hours helping me prepare for the AP exam, and when I got a 5, he was as excited as if it had been his own achievement. I'm going to major in chemistry at Washington State because of him, and I hope to become the kind of teacher he was, someone who changes lives. Ethan's case became a focal point in ongoing national debates about juvenile justice reform, with legal scholars and child development experts citing it in arguments about the appropriateness of trying juveniles as adults and imposing adult sentences on offenders whose brains are still developing. A documentary titled Christmas Morning, the Ethan Thompson case, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January 2026, presenting a nuanced examination of the case that neither excused Ethan's actions nor ignored the questions raised by sentencing a 16-year-old to die in prison. The film included interviews with jurors, legal experts, and Margaret Hayes, though Ethan himself declined to participate, his attorneys advising against any public statements that might affect his ongoing appeals. The Ring doorbell camera that had provided the crucial evidence breaking open the case became the center of a technological ethics debate with privacy advocates, pointing to the Thompson case as an example of how everyday surveillance technology was creating a world where private actions were increasingly subject to documentation and scrutiny. Trevor Phillips, the neighbor whose camera had captured the damning evidence, expressed mixed feelings about his role in the case. Glad the truth came out, but it's strange to think that a security camera I installed to catch package thieves ended up sending a teenage boy to prison for life. I never thought about how these devices make us all witnesses to things we never intended to see. Spokane Central High School, where Robert Thompson had taught for 15 years, created a memorial science garden in his honor, featuring native Washington plants and interpretive signs explaining the ecological systems at work in the small space. The garden became both an outdoor classroom for science teachers and a quiet place of reflection for students and faculty who had known and respected Robert. A simple stone marker at the garden center bore the inscription, Robert James Thompson, 1982-2024. He taught us to see the wonder in the world around us, making no mention of the tragic circumstances of his death, but focusing instead on the positive impact of his life and career. Ethan's second appeal, filed in early 2027, focused on ineffective assistance of counsel, arguing that his trial attorney had failed to adequately present expert testimony on adolescent brain development and the coercive influence of his relationship with an older woman. This appeal, like the first, was rejected, though by a narrower margin, with two judges writing a strong dissent that questioned whether contemporary standards of decency permitted sentencing a juvenile to life without parole, regardless of the crime's severity. Legal observers noted that the divided decision suggested Ethan might eventually find success with federal appeals, though the process would likely take many years and offer no guarantee of a different outcome. 3 years after the murder, Ethan granted his first interview to a graduate student, researching juvenile offenders serving adult sentences. The resulting academic paper described a young man who had aged beyond his years during his incarceration, developing an interest in psychology and taking every educational opportunity available within the prison system. The researcher noted that Ethan spoke of his crime with what appeared to be genuine remorse, describing how his understanding of his actions and their impact had evolved as his brain matured and the manipulative nature of his relationship with Monroe became clearer to him. "I couldn't see it then, but Jessica never loved me." Ethan was quoted as saying, "She loved the power she had over me, and I was so desperate to keep that relationship that I destroyed the only person who truly loved me unconditionally." Robert Thompson's students continued to feel the impact of his loss long after his death, with many changing their educational and career paths after losing their mentor and advocate. Jordan Martinez, who had been planning to attend community college, was accepted to MIT with a recommendation letter Robert had written just weeks before his death, describing Jordan's extraordinary potential and passion for scientific inquiry. At his graduation, Jordan wore a small chemistry-themed pin that had belonged to Robert, given to him by Margaret Hayes, who had maintained connections with many of her brother's former students. "Mr. Thompson believed in me when I didn't believe in myself," Jordan told local reporters. "Everything I achieve in my career will be partly because of him." The legal principle established in Ethan's case that juveniles could still receive life without parole for particularly premeditated murders, despite evolving standards regarding juvenile sentencing influenced subsequent cases. Throughout Washington and neighboring states, prosecutors in Oregon and Idaho cited the Thompson decision when pursuing maximum sentences against juvenile offenders in similar cases, while defense attorneys in more progressive jurisdictions used it as an example of why juvenile justice reform was urgently needed. The case became a standard reference in law school, criminal justice courses, with professors using it to illustrate the tension between retributive justice and developmental psychology in the treatment of juvenile offenders. A decade after the Christmas morning murder, Spokane had largely moved on, though Robert Thompson's name remained honored at the high school and through the scholarship program that had by then helped 12 students pursue higher education in scientific fields. Ethan, now 26, had completed a bachelor's degree through a prison education program and was working on a master's in psychology. His prison counselor reporting that he had become a mentor to younger inmates and developed insight into his crime that had been absent during his trial. Margaret Hayes had retired from teaching and moved to California to be near her children, making peace with her decision to sever contact with Ethan, while continuing to honor her brother's memory through annual contributions to the scholarship fund. The Thompson case eventually found its way into criminology textbooks as a case study in juvenile justice, family violence, and the intersection of digital evidence with criminal investigation. Law enforcement agencies across the country used the case in Training sessions about the value of canvassing for private security cameras during murder investigations with the Ring doorbell footage that had broken open the case, becoming an iconic example of how everyday technology could capture crucial evidence. The increasing use of doorbell cameras and other private surveillance systems in the decade following the case created what one legal scholar called an ambient witness society, where traditional notions of privacy were being redefined by technology that constantly recorded public spaces. In the final analysis, the legacy of State versus Ethan Thompson extended far beyond the specific tragedy of one family in Spokane, Washington. It became part of the evolving national conversation about juvenile justice, digital privacy, and the criminal justice system's response to family violence. The case raised difficult questions about how society should balance accountability for heinous crimes against emerging understanding of adolescent development, questions that remained unresolved as Ethan Thompson continued to serve his sentence. Growing from the 16-year-old who had killed his father into a young man who would indeed, as Judge Blackwood had starkly predicted, grow old and die in prison unless future changes to juvenile sentencing laws eventually offered him a path to redemption that the current system had definitively closed.